Well, this is our third of four in our series on New Horse Owners Workshop. And again, if you've been with us from series 1 and 2, you probably are aware that we've talked about what it takes to buy a horse and the purchase cost that it may incur. And then in series 2, we got into feed expenses and other expenses associated with ownership. Today in series 3, now what? We've got the horse, we know how to feed and manage him properly. Now what are we going to do with him? So today's discussion is simply basically about riding. And before we do that, I just want to remind you that if you are interested in other forms of educational material, we have Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all associated with Taking the Reins, Mississippi State University, that can provide you some resources for continued education, free of charge, of course, because it's social media based. And so you can check it out there. Also, the podcast is a great resource to kind of gain some insight from personal experiences with different guests and myself about horses and the horse world. So with two objectives today that I want us to kind of get under our belts and understand is one, that there's value in doing something with the horse. Of course, not everyone rides. Most people probably do, but there are some that just enjoy being around the horse and working in the barn and just having them on their property. But a lot of us want to ride and do things with them. So today we're going to talk about how that brings value to our lives and how we bring value to the horse. And then also, if we're going to do that, number 2 objective for today is that we need to identify equipment need and function. Probably one of the bigger questions I get is, what is proper equipment? How does it work? What should I use? What is legal in a competitive environment? Those types of questions. So those are things we'll jump into and to some extent as well. As we learn about riding the horse, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want you to understand maybe some questions that kind of provoke us thinking about how the horse thinks. So what do you think happens when we treat horses as pets or even humans? Of course, a lot of people do treat horses as pets, and that's fine, but they are considered livestock legally. But when we do treat them as pets, we do need to understand that there is a dynamic that they expect. And if we know how horses think in general, then we can start to consider a little bit differently how they're perceiving what we're doing and how we're communicating with them based on what they expect from us. So we do have to think about what they expect. How do they work in an environment that is conducive to horses? How do they work through the horse herd? How do they treat each other in that herd? Are all concepts that I should have an awareness of in order to be an effective communicator of horses or a good horseman. What is the role of horse in today's society? That's a great question because it's obviously shifted from previous generations as being a work animal into today's society. He is simply just a performance athlete. A lot of times, of course, there are people who use him as work, but most of us are using them in a role that is conducive to performance, exercise, competition, and whatnot. So it is a different role today. How important is body language? Do you use it with other people? Do you read people in day-to-day activities? And I would venture to say that you do. The horse is no different. As long as we're aware of that, then we can make some better judgment calls and decisions in the training process. This is a big one that a lot of people don't address sometimes. Should we discipline/punish animals? And if so, how do we do it? Are there varying levels? And I believe the answer is yes and yes. We should discipline animals. There's a fine line between punishment and discipline, and even maybe abuse. And so we got to make sure that we don't cross or gray those lines. Discipline or punishment for behavior should be swift. It should be pretty quick so that the horse understands what he did wrong. And then many times our approach to disciplining a horse is so that we train him well. There's an old saying that says that the best thing you can do, I'm paraphrasing, but the best thing we can do for a horse is to train him well so that when he interacts with people in his future life, they will treat him with kindness and enjoy being around him. And that's exactly right. Kind of like kids, I think we should probably discipline our children in a way that makes them good adults. And so that's kind of the same approach that I want you to be thinking about in discipline or punishment of animals, here, horses. And then the question is, are there varying levels? And the answer is, of course there are, depending on where the horse is at in terms of his experiences, his training level, his age. All these things are going to give us some concept of how we should punish the animal, punish the horse. Further questions to ponder here for ourselves is that can confidence and self-esteem improve by working with horses? These are all peer-reviewed journal publication type of thought-provoking questions where there's scientific data available that tend to say that it does, along with impacting the types of impact the horse has on us. How does your perception of horses affect your progress in working with them? All these things can be answered in multiple publications. I left one here for you to look up if you're curious about that. Here at the bottom of this slide, you can look into reading more in depthly about those types of questions. But it's just pretty clear that working with horses does improve a lot of things about how we consider ourselves, our confidence, our day-to-day activities, our stress levels, our anxiety, all these things the horse can help with when we work with him. So what about the horse? What can I do with the horse? We have to consider him a non-meat animal. He's a different player in the livestock world. If he's a livestock animal, other livestock species are used as meat animals. But the horse obviously here is not, at least here in the U.S. And so we have to consider how do we add value to the horse, and really the only way to add value to the horse is through the training process. So by riding them and doing other things as far as getting them ground broke and lunging and able to load in a trailer and some different things like that, we add value, though a tremendous amount of value when we start to ride and perform and compete with the horse. Then that's where our real added value comes from. But that may not be the only reason that we ride. We may ride for enjoyment, relaxation, exercise. These are all further aspects of why we may ride. However, enjoyment, relaxation, those components of riding only come about, in my opinion, with a well-trained horse. I don't find much enjoyment or relaxation in a horse that at any moment may run off with me, doesn't want to stop, does some things like that they're gonna probably take away from the relaxation and enjoyment aspect of riding. If our primary added value comes from training, then we need to just have the basic understanding of what that training is. And again, this is not a discussion to get really in depth. I'm just kind of skimming the surface, so to speak, on what may be out there for you to think about and consider as you own the horse. The horse is very sensitive to touch. We know that. He's a 1,200-pound animal. Fly can land on his back. He can twitch that little bitty piece of his skin in order to get the fly to move, and so, or twitch his tail. So he is very sensitive to touch, and we use that to our advantage. Horses learn on the release of pressure. What they really want in the wild and in their own day-to-day activities is to stand around in the pasture or stall, eat grass, and kind of enjoy their lives. They are not really gung-ho about being ridden and worked and doing these other things. However, when we do that, when we ask the horse to work, we've got to use to our advantage a way to make him start to think about the concepts that we want, and we do that with pressure release. It's the most used type of communication, and here you can see this man on the Palomino. He's getting his horse to be supple or soft by pulling on the left rein. The only way that horse learns to give to that pressure is that there has to be a subsequent release of the pressure. So the horse, in theory, is thinking, okay, you've asked me to turn my head this way, and if I do it, what's going to happen next is that I'm going to be out of this situation and be free again of pressure. So I'll just do this and go with the program. And that's kind of the mentality in a nutshell that we're thinking about with the training process. Just to give you just the most basic understanding of the learning process, this gets very in-depth, and I could spend a lot of time on this slide here, but I'm not. I'm just going to give you the basics here. There is a 3-step process to teaching almost anything. Horses or people can learn from this process how to do something. So if I want the horse to turn, like in this picture, I have to provide some kind of a cue, which is a stimulus. I've got to give some kind of a cue to tell the horse to do something. Secondly, he's going to give some form of a response, and there's only 2 options here. His response is either going to be the correct response of what I want, or the non-correct response, the incorrect response. After that happens, and I recognize that, the third piece of this equation is that we have to reinforce that behavior. Now, based on whether or not the response was correct or incorrect, is going to give me an idea of what I should do with my reinforcement. Is my reinforcement going to be positive or is it going to be negative? So examples will be positive. We just stated that horses want release of pressure. So my positive reinforcement would be the release of pressure or praise, pat on the neck, something like that. Or if the response is incorrect, my reinforcement will be the furtherance of pressure in some capacity. So in this picture, this guy wants this horse to move to the right. He's given some form of a cue, which is going to be the neck rein on the neck. And the horse's response is to turn his head and start to move to the right. Eventually, when this maneuver is done, the horse is turned around a time or two. The positive reinforcement will be that the neck pressure goes away, the leg pressure goes away, and that's the release of pressure. And now we have a positive learning experience in this example. Again, could go a number of different ways and it could get very in-depth, but that is typically the basic learning process for training horses. Other things to consider in the rules of training is, let's identify what broke is. That's kind of an ugly word sometimes to some people, but really what I'm thinking about is a horse that knows his job, willing to do his job, and it's a horse that I can enjoyably have a good time riding. So a broke horse, that's not a bad word, it's a good word. I want a horse that is broke, he's pleasant to be around, knows his job. When I ask him to do something with a cue or stimulus, his response is, yes sir, I'll do that, and we have a good time with that horse. But I should know my expectations, obviously, when I'm starting to train a horse. What can he do, what can he not do, and what do I want to progress him into being able to do. When I'm training, I want to use the simplest, the most obvious cues first. This is much like teaching school. We go to school as a first grader and we don't learn geometry. We learn simple addition. And so when we start the process of learning math as a person, we learn 1 + 1 first. And that is the exact same approach we should have with a young horse or the inexperienced horse who doesn't know, the untrained, unbroke horse, is that we should go the very most simple steps first to make things very obvious in what we do or what we're asking for. Also, we should make very obvious the release of the pressure so that the cue that has been given is communicated effectively in the long run. Now, this does take time. It takes repetition, and it takes activity after activity after activity in order to get this routine down. When I'm training, I want to give close approximations. If the horse gets close to what I'm asking for, that's a win. And so I'm going to release the pressure of whatever maneuver I'm asking for. For instance, if I'm teaching the horse to back up, I'm not expecting him to back up 8 steps the first try. What I'm asking him to do is maybe shuffle 1 foot backwards and then give the release that I want to give to reinforce what he's done correctly. And I want to give partial credit too. If maybe, and all horses are different. You may be teaching a horse to do something for the first time and he gets it pretty well for the first time. Another horse out of the barn, you get on him and it's not going so well. I want to look for opportunities to give partial credit, to build on a good sequence of events and be able to give the horse an opportunity to have pressure released. I definitely need to avoid massing of trials and know when to quit. I should do that for sure. With young horses especially, I need to ride them. I found most time it works for me. It works to be riding 5-6 days a week. On the young horse, an experienced horse, 5-6 days a week. And that might be 20 minutes, 15 minutes. It might be, I've got on horses before 10-15 minutes and found a very good stopping point and want to make it clear that when we do the right things, the pressure is gone. So I get off right then and loosen off the girth and we go back to the barn. So I try to think about avoiding massing of trials and definitely know when to quit. Short daily sessions versus 1 day per week. Long session, obviously you're going to get the point across when you've got these 10, 15, 20-minute sessions every day versus 2 or 3 days a week for an hour or two. Very, very easy to figure that out when you ride a lot. I need to use repetition for sure, and that is consistent repetition. Whenever I ask for a cue, it needs to be the exact same way, the exact same timing. Everything that I'm doing needs to be timely, and then I can become faster and more efficient as we have experiences built upon experiences. So make a plan when you're riding. Make sure you make a plan. And this is a question I ask of all my students and something to think about, and it makes good sense, I think. If I asked you if you could improve the horse's training ability 1%, however you want to measure that, if I could improve him 1% per day, every time I ride, I can improve 1% per day. Is that a true statement? And I think the answer is pretty clear when you think about it. No. It sounds like I could. 1% is not that much, but built over 100 days, after 100 days, I should have the perfect horse at whatever discipline he's in if I'm progressing 1% per day. And we all know that when we ride, 100 days is really pretty green still in the world of training. This may take the horse 6 months, a year, and some advanced disciplines, years of training in order to get to the point that they're very comfortable doing the job that we're asking them to do. We can work on several skills at a time, but we also need to make sure that the form of the maneuver or the event, the thing that we're doing, the form is there before the speed ever starts to increase. If we increase speed and lose the form of whatever that event is or maneuver is, then we're not doing a horse justice and we're actually going backwards. All right, so shifting gears a little bit here, the equipment discussion. If we kind of have a game plan for riding, now we just need to have a basic understanding of equipment, and I'm just going to do this fairly quickly just so you have, maybe provoke more questions than answers. But when we ride, we basically have when we compete, we have two umbrellas. We have an English event and we have a discipline, we have a Western discipline, and those events are very similar but also very different as well. And one of the things that they're different in is tack and attire. And so we have English bridles. You can see the horse on the right has an English bridle, the horse on the bottom left there is a Western bridle. And some of the similarities and differences here are that in the English world, we have nose bands or cavesons that are built into the bridles. Like you can see the nose band around the top of the horse's nose there, middle of his nose. Whereas in the Western world, that's not a legal piece of equipment. We do use them in some capacity, but not in a competitive legal tack and attire setting. So a Western horse doesn't have a nose band. Split reins are commonly used, and you can see a set of split reins on the horse on the left, whereas buckled reins are the norm in English bridles. And then, of course, both of those setups have, depending on the type of bit being used in the English rider, we can have curb change and chin straps in both settings. This is a really neat picture to understand exactly what's going on with the horse's mouth when you put a bit in his mouth. We need, as riders, to have an awareness of what it means to pull on our set of reins, to engage the bit. How is that functioning in the horse's mouth? Oh, the good Lord put the horse into this position here with an interdental space, this gap between his front teeth and his back teeth. There's this big gap of the bars of the mouth, the interdental space here, where the bit is going to sit. It sits right there, kind of up against those premolars in the back, but lays on the bars of the mouth. So if you thought the bit was contacting the horse's teeth, not necessarily. It's in this interdental space. So he's anatomically perfect for fitting a bit. But when we add the skin and the hide and the flesh here, where we see these x-rays, you can see that even with a snaffle bit like on the left, the bit is laying against and applying some pressure to the tongue and coming into contact with the bars of the mouth as well. So while the snaffle bit, a smooth round, just a jointed snaffle bit, is considered a very easy bit to use, it can bring a lot of pressure if used incorrectly or used too harshly. The bit on the right is a curb bit. You can see the port there that gives relief to the tongue, but also sits on the bars of the mouth. And then I think that the thing I want you to take away here too is, a lot of times I get questions about, is the headstall too tight or too loose? You don't want the headstall to be so loose that the bit lays down against the canine teeth here of the horse in the front of the interdental space. But you also don't want it so tight that it's resting harshly against the premolars in the back. It needs to be seated there at half an inch in front of the premolar, or inch in front of the premolar, so that when you pick up on the bit, there is contact on the tongue and some other portions of the mouth, the bars of the mouth, not necessarily just the teeth. I want to provide some clarity to the definitions between snaffle and curb bit. I hear this a lot too. People look at or gauge whether it's a snaffle or a curb bit type of bit by the mouthpiece, and that's not how they're defined. Our bits kind of fall under two primary main categories, and that is a snaffle or a curb. That's not the only ones, but a lot of bits can either be classified snaffle or curb. And here is the definitions of the difference. A snaffle bit, like the one on the right in the gray horse's mouth, that is a snaffle bit. It provides direct pressure, the reins and the headstall attached to the rings on the bit. So you can see that this is an O-ring snaffle, full cheek snaffle on the horse on the right. It's got this O-shaped ring where the bit is, the reins are attached directly to that. So when the reins engage, this bit is enacted. The mouthpiece is contacted directly by the maneuverability of the rein. Whereas the Western horse on the left here, that horse is in a curb bit. You can see that the reins follow down and are attached to the end of these long pieces called shanks, which then lead up to the mouthpiece of the horse or engage the mouthpiece of the horse. And so we have this indirect pressure, and with that length, we're providing leverage to the mouthpiece and the reins and the headstall attached to the bottom of the shank. So it's considered indirect pressure. When a bit has a shank like that, it is a curb bit, versus when it is a ring bit and the reins are attached directly to the ring, that is a snaffle bit, irregardless of the mouthpiece. All kinds of different snaffle bits. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but we kind of classified different types of bits based on whether they're O-rings, D-rings, egg butts are pretty much the most common type. Here you can see in the top left-hand corner here of this chart that an O-ring looks like an O, but a lot of people call it a loose ring. Egg butt or D-ring, those are the common forms, but again, there's different types like a half or full cheek, again, the reins attached directly to the ring, providing direct leverage. Now, the mouthpiece is important to understand as well. The diameter, how big around that mouthpiece is, and how it's formed, whether it's smooth or it's got jagged edges or it's got something else in it that makes it non-smooth, will affect severity. So a smooth, round, or oval mouthpiece that is fairly big, if it's if it's got a big diameter to it, that the pressure that is placed in the horse's mouth is going to, the energy from that is going to be spread out over a bigger surface area of the horse's mouth. Whereas a smaller diameter bit is going to be very direct in the pressure that it applies to a certain point in the horse's mouth. Then when you start adding things like twists, whether they're slow twists, single or double twist, or a corkscrew bit, when you're adding points to the diameter of that, or the roundness of it, you're putting edges to it. Now we're starting to bite into the areas of the mouth to provide a little bit more of a contact point, pressure point in the horse's mouth. We have to be aware of what that mouthpiece is made of. We look at curb bits here. We see that I want you just to identify mainly two pieces here. The purchase is the piece from where the headstall attaches, from there up until the point of the actual mouthpiece or the bars of the mouthpiece. That's the purchase area. Followed by below that is the length of the shank. Now the length of the shank is going to vary. It could be 2 inches, it could be 8.5 inches, it could be very long. The length of that shank is going to be the reason that it either acts with less or more leverage, giving you less or more pressure in the horse's mouth. The other portion here I want you to take point of is the port. It looks like it would be there to alleviate pressure of the tongue, and it is, but when actually engaged and rotates up, it can come into contact with the palate or the roof of the horse's mouth and provide another point of pressure when we start to ride or engage the bit. Here are multiple different types. You see so many different configurations, lengths, shapes, all kinds of different things on the shape of the shank. And just be aware of how that lays, how it engages, and again, the length is going to be the point that gives you some ideas of pressure. Here's a picture of pressure, and if I put the pivot point right smack dab in the middle, this would be a bit like an elevator bit would be an example of the top picture here. Elevator bit has an equal purchase length to shank length, and so it's the leverage there becomes not as heavy, or the amount of pressure applied is not as heavy as if I shorten the purchase, like on the bottom picture here. If I shorten the purchase and have a long bit shank length, then the amount of pressure that I pull to the shank is going to give a whole lot more pressure than what I'm pulling on to the feel of the mouthpiece. So just for instance, if I'm riding a long shank curve bit, and I'm just putting out numbers here, I put 2, 3, 4 pounds of pressure with the rein. I pull on the reins with 2 or 3, 4 pounds of pressure. The horse is not receiving that same amount of pressure in his mouth. He might be receiving 10 or 12 or 14 pounds of pressure into his mouth at the same time. So I have to be aware of that, especially if you see people start to really pull on a set of reins. If they're riding in a long shank curve, that could be problematic. Other things to consider is the port height. Obviously, we can get up to, we see as high as 3.5, 4-inch port heights on some bits, pretty high. And then other things that we see like the rollers on some mouthpieces. I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about gag bits, but gag bit is another form of bit, and it can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes and different configurations. But really what you're doing when you pull on the reins from this diagram on the right hand side here, when you pull on the reins, you're not just engaging the mouthpiece, but you're actually shortening the headstall from the pole to the horse's mouth. Is starting to collapse. So even if you've got what you consider a snaffle bit, you're really acting more leveragey here and putting a lot more pressure in the horse's face and on his head with a gag bit. Nothing wrong with using a gag bit if you know how to use it or there's a need for it and the horse definitely knows how to give to pressure at this point, then that might be something that works for your training program. But for a young horse who does not know how to give to pressure, not something I would want to use. When you think about severity, I hear this all the time. I might need a new bit because I'm not getting the response from the horse that I once was or I need. Well, the question is not necessarily do you need to jump to the next higher bit in terms of severity or harshness, but you may need to be softer with your hands and more comfortable with your hands. So when you think about severity of the bit, think about the diameter of the mouthpiece, whether or not it has twists or uneven points. And then with a curve bit, think about also the shank length because that's what's providing leverage and can be giving some harshness to what you're doing. We could also go bitless. Hackamores are a big name for kind of a large umbrella for anything without a bit. When you went and rode your horse as a kid, you went and put the halter on the horse and you slung the lead rope over his back, tied it to the other side of the halter, and then jumped on him bareback. You were actually riding with a hackamore. Be really, really similar to what we use today in the side pull. But we can do lots of different things. Now, like with the picture of the horse on the left, the sorrel, flaxen mane sorrel horse on the left, you might think, well, that's pretty nice. I can use that because there's nothing harsh or severe about that. Well, no, there's nothing harsh or severe about it to his mouth because there's no mouthpiece, but it functions a lot of the same way because you can see something that looks very similar to a shank. And you've got a lot of pressure points. When you engage this mechanical hackamore, there's pressure going to the bottom side of the chin, there's pressure coming to the top side of the nose, and there's pressure coming to the top side of the pole. And so you're creating a very pinchy point for that horse, and he may react to it very incorrectly if he does not know how to give to pressure. So just because you're not using a bit doesn't mean that it's something that may not be severe in the way it's being used. Saddles comes in all shapes and sizes. I won't spend a whole lot of time here. I think that the biggest question I'd have is whether or not people have is that whether or not they want to ride in a leather or synthetic saddle, and synthetic material saddles are obviously cheaper and so might be more aimed at the low budget rider that may not have a whole lot to spend or may be taken aback by what a nice leather saddle costs. But you have to think about longevity too. You can buy a $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 leather saddle. That sounds like a lot to some people, but if it's made well, then you may have that saddle if you keep good care of it. It'll last 20 or 30 years if you take good care of it. So in the long run, the leather saddle may be better, whereas synthetic saddle may start to come apart a little more quickly. So just something to think about there. We have to think about what we're going to do with it, not just for the comfort of the horse, but for the comfort of the rider. So it's designed for a work-related discipline in mind. When we look at the size of the whole makeup here of the saddle, here's these two pictures on the left give us a really good idea of, we have to think about the type of horse we're riding. If we're riding a stock type horse, it's got a little bit more roundness to the wither, a little bit of wither, but they're a little more fleshy. Then a normal angle to the gullet will be fine, and most of our stock type saddles, stock Western saddles, are built that way. However, if I take that same saddle and try to ride an Arabian with it, Arabian horse is built more narrow, it's got a lot more wither and a lot less of a barrel to it, and so that saddle is going to sit on top of the wither and on the back a little improperly, and going to make the horse pretty sore. So we have to think about how the bars of this tree of the saddle are fitting along the back of the horse and connecting and fitting with his wither for sure, so that we don't make him sore. And then also you have to think about, as a rider, what do sizes mean in terms of, we hear saddles are measured, they'll say it's a 16-inch saddle, or it's a 16 and a half, or it's a 15. And what they're talking about is a seat size. And so that may be something that's a comfort decision for a rider in buying a saddle. So think about how the saddle should regularly be, saddles should regularly be inspected, because with sweat, heat, humidity, wear and tear becomes pretty common. And so we see the top side of the saddle a lot of times. It can address cracks or concerns, but what a lot of times we don't do is flip the saddle upside down and look underneath it and see what's going on underneath. So really be careful about wear and tear of saddles and making sure that leather is flexible, not cracked and stretchy. Here's the question, though, that a lot of people get: does the saddle fit the rider? Does the saddle fit the horse? I have a really good podcast with Calvin Waters, that he's a saddle maker, that will address a whole bunch of that in depthly, about how the saddle should fit and what we should do to make it work for us and the horse. Whether you ride an English saddle or a Western saddle, you should kind of have an awareness of what the different parts and pieces of the saddle are. So I've just kind of make you aware of that. And you would think that Western saddles would be more expensive because they're bigger and heavier and have more leather, but that's not really necessarily the case. There are some English saddles out there that are very expensive. So don't expect to pay less just because you ride English. You'll be paying the same amount. And then on the Western side, again, so much variability. If you're going to show, then you're going to see saddles like the saddle on the right-hand side that have silver on them, or kind of ornamental. That's personal preference. The saddle on the left, you could show in that just fine. I would just advise you to make sure that your tack and attire in a competitive environment is clean and neat and looks like you care, just like your horse. And so just give some attention to the details on that kind of stuff, and you'll be in good shape. If you have particular questions about any of this, please feel free to give me an email. There's my email address on the bottom there. And then I would ask that if you just take 2 minutes to click on that QR code. If you don't know how that works, you just open the camera on your phone, hold it up, point it at that QR code, and it'll give you a link to a website where we have a short, like 4-question survey that we would love to know your feedback. So if you got time, please do that for us. We'd appreciate that. And as a reminder, February 15th, same time, 10 to 11 Central Standard Time, we're going to be wrapping up our New Horse Owner series on what to do when you're ready to sell, or what kind of paperwork do you need in order to sell your horse and to verify and prove that you own this horse. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next month, February 15th.